Okay, hi, Justine. As you know, I'm Associate Professor in Media Studies at Wits University, also a media freedom activist, and I hold the chair of SANEV's Ethics and Diversity Committee, South African National Editors Forum. And you, what you doing?
I am a lawyer in media and electronic communications. I'm an adjunct visiting prof at Wits, which is a part-time position, I should say, that I hold mostly doing research with the Link Center and some teaching. I also am a freedom of expression activist, and I'm chair of the legal subcommittee of the SOS Coalition.
Yeah, so now what are the issues? My issues are really political, media and politics issues, and yours are to do with regulation, internet, taxation. So it's going to be very interesting that we just talk about what are the burning issues for you, and then we'll talk about what concerns me. Do you want to kick off? You were talking about the news about Amazon.
Yes, I saw the most extraordinary thing on Twitter this morning about Amazon not having paid any tax. And I just can't possibly be true because it's one of the global big five. It's right up there. And
what was the source of the news, Justine? What if it's fake news? I mean, if this is real, this is a big tax fraud story.
Exactly. So I went online and I checked it at a number of reputable news sites. And it's not that they pay zero tax at all, but they do pay absolutely, or last year at least, 2018, they paid not 1 cent in federal taxes in the US on a profit, not a turnover, on a profit of $11 billion.
Wow.
Which
so
obviously South African rand terms is hundreds of billions of rand, and not 1 cent of profit. And it just, I know that a number of companies, Facebook, Apple, a number of the big tech and internet-based companies really try to threaten whole governments by saying, unless we get the tax breaks, we are simply moving our operations to more congenial tax environments. And yet, corporate tax as a percentage of tax bills all over the world are declining. And poor people like you and me, academics and professionals and the middle class, are the people that are stumping up a vastly high percentage of a tax bill, and I think it's just absolutely wrong.
It's absolutely wrong. I agree. But what's also concerning me at the moment, which is related to that of the big monopolies, is that they're getting away with it. And even though as activists we keep talking about how to tax Facebook, who should be doing this taxation? If it's governments, then we're heading back into also a dark age where governments can then decide what to put on, what not to put on. So while big companies are getting away with murder in terms of not paying tax, we're getting squeezed in terms of what kind of media we have, because advertising is going on to the big companies, the big tech companies who are calling themselves tech companies and not media companies, but they've actually taken media away from us. So it's a terrible conundrum. What ideas do you have that what should we be doing? I don't know. It's a horror story. What should we be doing?
It's really interesting that you talk about this. I mean, one of the things that I've been fascinated by is how Europe as a trading group has been able to come together and as a trading bloc really impose on the big tech companies like Google and Facebook a more fair way of operating in those jurisdictions. And it's interesting because, the Europeans were the ones that said, you have to do data protection properly, Facebook. And then Facebook had to change not only its European operations, but that had far-reaching effects back in the US as well as in Europe and in other jurisdictions that we've benefited from. And I'm starting to see all over Africa a wake-up by regulators and governments about the rise of OTT, over-the-top, so-called over-the-top services, where people are providing audio-visual content that can take the place of broadcasters, but also, as you say, and I think this is critical, take the place of news organizations. And we know that newspapers are dying on the vine because advertising is going to Facebook and Google. Now, it's not that that's US advertising. Very often it's our advertising. It's South African.
Absolutely. It's our advertising. And, you know, this is one of the reasons, you know, my big issue is the retrenchment issues, the media organizations being decimated, newsrooms being depleted of staff, senior staff, because they can't pay them. And at the same time, the community media, for instance, a sector which has just gone down by more than 50%, you know, from whatever, 500 and something thousand newspapers to about 200 and something. And those communities are now coalescing on Facebook. So Facebook gets the advertising. And the only way, I can't see any campaign, there isn't really one that's out there at the moment in South Africa, but the only way in which to do this is to climb onto an international bandwagon of everyone doing, so all media at different levels doing a similar, the same campaign, you know, obviously looking into local conditions as well. But there must be some overlap with the local and the international about how one can deal with this taxation. Because as I was saying, if it's left to governments, and we know what governments can do, it's not good enough. It's
so I have a different take on that, actually. I think it's only governments that can be powerful enough to demand and
but if you take China, for instance, take the example of China, it does exactly that. It regulates the internet, it regulates Google, regulates
sorry, I'm interrupting.
Yeah, it regulates everything, and the people who are then affected the most in terms of access to information are actually people on the ground, because when governments start to do this, it's governments that can use this to their own advantages in terms of, well, then this is the kind of content we need out, and this is the kind of content that's going to be in the national interest. I've got a big problem with that, because this is exactly the way the world is going at the moment. You know, you have certain bills, and this is across the board, from whether it's the US, the UK, and we've had a raid in Australia as well about what is the national interest. And we have in South Africa a protection of state information bill, which we've dubbed the secrecy bill, which hasn't been passed. So once governments start to regulate information, although I'm not giving you who the alternative should be about who should be regulating this, we need some kind of regulation, some kind of tax reform. So I'm not sure who it should be, but once governments start to interfere without the input of civil society, activists, media themselves, it's a free-for-all for governments to do what they want in their interest, not in the national interest.
I think that's fascinating, and I've got two main responses that I want to make to that. One is that regulating taxation issues and regulating who benefits and who shares in the profits made by those companies that are essentially pulling out all advertising revenue from, for example, African media sources is a very different issue from regulating access to the internet and content. So I think it's essential for governments to come together, like, for example, the African Free Trade treaty has just come into force. There's going to be an Africa Free Trade Agreement. And what that's going to mean is that we're going to start developing Africa as a trading bloc. It's going to be essential for governments, I think, to one, make sure that the companies that are getting advertising revenue from Africa and service costs from service revenues from Africa, for example, the Netflix Showmaxes, for example, they are the ones that are situated offshore. So in fact, that wouldn't include Showmax, which is South African, but a Netflix, for example, would have to contribute some of those revenues back into Africa. And I think that there are two big ways of doing it. One, it needs to go into a pot to develop local content across the continent. Two, it's got to go into a pot to ensure the survival of African news and information sources, independent media sources. That, for me, is a different issue to regulate content. And on this, I'm with you. Governments regulating content, well, we've seen that. We've seen that all over. That's what internet shutdowns, internet throttlings, and, you know, banning sites and stuff.
So what I'm saying is that not opening the door to that kind of thing, internet shutdowns and throttling? Because once you've got government having the main hand in this whole thing, it's exactly what can and has, as we know, led to internet shutdowns. We've had it in Ethiopia, we had it in Zimbabwe, we've had it in China, we've had it in Venezuela, we've had it everywhere, except for a couple of places.
And I'm afraid in Africa more so than on any other continent. It's really shocking. And what I agree with you on is that the internet and content regulation of the internet, how we're going about it, has got to be a focus for freedom of expression activists all over the continent. And we're seeing positive signs. The new principles on internet freedoms are really important. There are a number of key good principles there, including that Africans need to benefit from the economic, from the online services that they pay for, from the advertising they pay for, and I think that's very positive. But I agree with you. It's going to take, it's not just an issue, a multilateral government exercise. It's absolutely critical that civil society is involved.
Yes.
There. And I thought something like the Christchurch call, which involved civil society from the very beginning, was an important step of saying that we have to co-regulate these issues. It's government, it's civil society, and it's the big tech companies have to come together to agree rules around what kind of content, incredibly narrow, limited kinds of content, ought not to be publicly available on the internet, and for the rest, it must be guaranteed.
Look, I mean, it all sounds very gloomy and pessimistic. Are there any optimistic moments in this whole thing? I mean, is anything actually happening that you know of that we can use as an example?
Yes.
Yes, tell me, please.
So the AU is busy, as we speak, updating their Declaration on Principles of Freedom of Expression. Fantastic. And the new draft that has just come out is absolutely amazing. And
wonderful.
Part of the reason it's amazing is that it has called on civil society organizations all over the continent to input. SANEF is inputting, just from South Africa, I know that SANEF is inputting, MMA is inputting. I know that APC, which is doing, the Center for Alternative Communications, they're inputting. all over the continent. And there are now loads of provisions in there about the internet, about protecting freedom of expression online, about ensuring that only those grounds that are governed by international law for not allowing freedom of expression are allowed in Africa online. And
no, that's fantastic. So we obviously will come up with some fantastic declaration. And what makes me very optimistic is the fact that we do have robust civil society organizations in the media space. I mean, we've got about 25 just in South Africa. So, you know, if we do an African continent thing, it's very difficult for us to be, which we can do, of course, lead the world. But, you know, if we do an African continent thing as an example of what can be done via this mechanism with the AU, it would be absolutely amazing.
And the free trade stuff, I mean, I'm not a trade lawyer, I'm not a trade expert at all, but I am involved in this in some ways, looking at the communications sector to come up with proposals for Africa on what their, you know, what sort of best practice looks like for trade in communications. And the African governments has specifically asked us to look at OTT services as well. And I think that we're on the threshold of a really interesting period, because countries like Cameroon and countries like Ethiopia, although I think there's a new wind blowing through Ethiopia with the change of government, they're just not really going to be able to do what they got away with doing in the past.
I agree.
I really think that the time of internet and social media shutdowns is coming to an end.
That's fantastic. I agree. I'm also beginning to feel that. And as soon as these shutdowns happen, they get such terribly bad publicity and exposure that they get embarrassed and quickly put it on again, which is also great. But I wanted to talk about, if you don't mind, something else. Just ask you your ideas. I mean, there's just a whole lot of research that has been done, ideas on how to combat this. But why do you think the harassment and the cyberbullying of women journalists it's just increasing? It's just like, why is this happening? Why have women become the vulnerable target? It's just exactly the replication of what happens in society at large, or is it something in particular related to the internet and how it can be done via social media, and that's why people do it? What ideas do you have about why this is happening at the rate?
So it's very interesting that you say that. One is that the online space is a mirror of our world in some ways. It's certainly a mirror of bad behavior offline gets translated into bad behavior online. So people, I honestly found it astonishing that people, for example, were threatening to rape Karima Brown, and I've seen Ranjeni Moonsamy, I think, has also been the subject of people saying, we're going to punch you in the face, we're going to hurt you. That
there's been Ferial Hafaji, there have been all sorts of women in the public space who have been doing the watchdog journalism, public interest journalism, uncovering corruption. So there's a bit of a trend and a bit of a pattern, but including with the ruling party and its vilification of journalists. It worries me very much indeed, and is naming and shaming the only way in which we can combat this? Can we make a law about it?
There is already a law about it that no one ever uses, called the Protection from Harassment.
Yeah, nobody uses that. Some of us know about that, and we don't go to court with that.
Yeah.
We go for defamation and all sorts of other things, but damage to reputation, but we don't use that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that journalists, I think organizations like SANEF, who, I mean, there is no longer, sadly, the union of journalists anymore, but SANEF sort of operates like that. I actually think we need to be doing class action on behalf of all journalists to go to the courts for a protection order from all political parties against what constitutes harassment. There is a big difference, in my view, between critiquing a journalist's work, which I think should be absolutely up for grabs.
Yes, of course.
And necessary, of course it's necessary. And the kinds of things that we are seeing with the
so what did you say? Protection of order, a protection of order law, which, okay, so it's an order that you can get, and as soon as you're harassed, then you can refer to this order, and then they can pay costs and damages for whatever they've done. Okay.
Absolutely. But I think across the board, because at the moment everyone is focused on the EFF because of the Karima judgment, but also because of the Trevor Manuel judgment. They are not the only ones.
No, they're not the only ones. It's across the board, actually. I mean, if you think about what Helen Ziller has been saying on Twitter about journalists and how she calls them out and picks on them and makes, vilifies them for any criticism of her. It's really across the board of all political parties, politicians, and so forth. It's horrendous. The problem is in South Africa, about 10 years ago, maybe even more, we had good, strong unions. We had the ADJ in the 80s, the Association of Democratic Journalists. Then we had the SAUJ, the South African Union of Journalists, and that's basically finished. Then we had MWASA, which organized workers, and they wanted to amalgamate that with journalists, and journalists didn't come to the party, unfortunately. So now, in fact, there's the Communication Workers Union, there's BAMAU at SABC, etc., but there's an array of different journalists who are not actually organizing journalists, or maybe it's journalists that are not coming to the party to wanting to be organized. And that's, that's created a terrible situation of a complete disarray in the sector where, you're not getting protection for journalists and you're not getting this kind of thing. So SANEV is a forum, an editors forum and a senior journalist forum and media trainers forum. But at the moment, it can't operate as a union, and it's not a union. But at the moment, of course, it does. It does court actions and interdicts, etc. It's acting in that space, but it can't act as a union. So I've been recently discussing, shouldn't we be having an adjunct wing to SANEV to say deal with specifically workers' issues, journalist shop floor issues. And, I'd like to put it on the agenda for SANEV and see if that will fly, see what we can do. In the meanwhile, it's just a bloodbath out there in terms of retrenchments, etc. It's awful.
It's awful. And I want to say that I absolutely agree with you. But I think that is also symptomatic of what is happening with the near collapse of COSATU.
Yeah, for sure.
It's unionism, particularly things like the wholesale theft of union savings and investments that we've seen, for example, in some of the unions, has really lent people to just really are not sure, I don't think, about the value of unions. And that, I think...
There are two issues there with COSATU. Once had over 1 million members, it's now got a couple of 100,000. And one of the things is the casualization of labor due to the new kind of technological age. And another issue is the politicization of unions backing different sides when it should be dealing with union issues. And then in terms of journalism, it's actually a complete replication of what's happening in society and the world at large, because everyone is talking about the fourth industrial revolution as though it is something that's coming, but it's not coming. It's, we're already dealing with it, and we've been dealing with it for a good 10 years already. So the issue, it's not a case of let's throw up our hands and there's nothing we can do about it. There's something we can do about it. We need to have these conversations and also have activism in the space combined with the legal inputs about what is available, what laws are available, how we can use them, which we don't. We're not aware of a lot of things. In that space. So I don't want to be totally pessimistic about everything. We just need to, just have our fingers on the pulse of what can be done, given our frameworks, our legal frameworks.
But Glenda, can I ask you, just on the issue of these attacks, I want to go back to your issue about attacking journalists. First of all, there are attacks on journalists across the board. But what I've noticed, it's my personal view, I'd be interested in yours. One is that on social media, for example, men seem to get criticism about their journalism, whereas women journalists seem to be personally vilely attacked and threatened with personal violence. Another thing I'm noticing, and I don't want to racialize this unnecessarily, but it does seem to me that Black journalists come in for, and dare I say, I'm sorry, but Indian journalists seem to come in for a particularly vicious time. And I just wonder, are you noticing that? Am I making it up?
I think it's gendered. I think it's racialized, and I think those are easy targets to call to in the kind of climate and the kind of post-apartheid South Africa that we live in. Number one. Number two, this is also happening all over the world. If you look at the Philippines, the editor of Rappler, also a person of color. It's Mexico. It's everywhere in the world. It's women journalists who have come in for this kind of what we call cyber misogyny, because it's bullying. It's bullying, and I've certainly noticed what you're talking about. Men definitely get away with it. They don't get personalized for what they wear, how they look, the color of their hair, the size of their thighs, that they will get.
Hello.
Sorry?
The size of their tummies.
The size of their tummies, etc. So, this is as old as history. Nonetheless, it shocks me. It still shocks me that this can be happening in 2019.
Yeah.
It keeps me up at night that, here we think there's a greater feminist consciousness that we're spreading. Here we think that there's more activism that's happening in the freedom of expression space. Here we think that the internet is going to be leveling of the playing fields for all. But to me, it's the social media space has become more, as everyone's spoken about, the echo chambers, the middle classes talking to each other, boosting each other's self-esteem and vanities, and so forth. And fights amongst people who don't agree with each other. There's no nuance. It's just you're either for this or you're against this. It's something that I think is happening in the world politically. It's part of the broad politics of the world where the middle ground is just being squashed right to the middle, and you get this left-wing knee-jerk reaction, you get this right-wing populism. The populists call themselves left-wing, but the very nationalist stuff that comes up with it is very right-wing, in fact. Absolutely. And the very anti-feminist, anti-woman sentiments that come, the racist stuff that come with it is very right-wing. So it worries me about what's happening in the world politically, And it feeds directly into the kind of space that we're operating in as media freedom activists, as academics, as journalists, as writers. It's extremely worrying, and this kind of trend, this very retrogressive trend that we see, anti-feminist, anti-progression.
It is something that I recently attended the Global Media Forum in Bonn in Germany, and speaker after speaker was talking about the fact that the way commercially social media is set up is the whole clickbait phenomenon is to drive society away from a set of shared values into the extremes where there is violence and a desire to shut down real debate. And I find it astonishing how many people who disagree with me on Twitter, and there are thousands of them, can't seem to deal with the arguments and respond on the arguments.
Yes.
But instead respond by, what do you know, or you just or
you white,
libtard, or you're a whitey. It is such a bore. But
it's
the
terrible.
thing is, Glenda, it is deliberate. It is set up by private companies who which is how
we are feeding into. It's a racket. It's a racket, and they're milking it all the way to the bank over these, what I call the world of binary oppositions, and we're all feeding into it when we participate. But I think our time is up now, Justine, unless there's something else that you... time is up.
No, our time is up. But one last thing that I just want to say, maybe we could get back together and talk about these other things at some point.
Absolutely.
There are over 600 robotic news presenters in China, AI robots.
Hectic.
AI is going to, you talk about OTT services and Facebook transforming the media. Wait until people trust the robot that is giving them their nightly news more than they trust the journalists. That is
right, that's just given me shivers. The horrible shivers.
To be talking about it because it's coming. It's coming. Okay. Glenda,
okay, we'll chat some more about that. Okay, lovely to chat. Thanks.
Take care.
Bye. You too.
Bye. Bye.